The insurance adjuster wrote it off as worthless, a total loss, just a pile of rotten timber and a demolition bill. He saw debris, but the old farmer saw a fortune, because buried inside that collapsed century-old barn were hand-hewn beams of antique white oak, and on the reclaimed timber market that wasn't trash, it was treasure. His name is Everett Cobb. He's 70 years old and he spent his entire life on this land in central Pennsylvania. For the insurance company, this was a simple property claim. For Everett, it was the moment he turned their $20,000 write-off into a discovery worth over $150,000. But how did a retired dairy farmer see value where a team of professionals saw only waste? And why did it take a collapse to reveal the fortune hidden in plain sight for a century? That barn was built by Everett's grandfather, Silas Cobb, in the spring of 1919. He built it from the woods on the property itself, white oak and chestnut trees that had been growing for 200 years before the Declaration of Independence was even signed. This wasn't lumber from a mill. This was old-growth timber, felled by hand, squared by axe and adze. The beams were massive, some of them 16 inches thick and 40 feet long, joined with mortise and tenon, held together by wooden pegs. It was a cathedral of agrarian engineering, and it stood for over a century. Everett was born in that barn's shadow in 1953. He learned to walk on its plank floor, stored his first tractor in it, and for 60 years it was just the big barn, a useful, constant, and familiar thing. He knew every creak in its floor, every patch of sunlight that fell through its boards in the afternoon, but he never thought of it as an asset. It was part of the farm's skeleton, until the night of the storm. It was a late March snowstorm, the wet, heavy kind that clings to everything. 18 inches fell in 12 hours. Everett heard the first groan around 3 in the morning, a deep wooden sigh he'd never heard before. By sunrise, the entire north side of the barn had slumped inward like a tired giant sitting down. The roof had collapsed, pancaking down onto the hayloft. It wasn't a total loss, but it was a catastrophic one. The structure was irreparable. Everett's farm insurance was through a major national carrier, the kind advertised during football games. He filed the claim the next morning. 2 weeks later, the adjuster arrived. His name was Robert. He was in his late 30s, wore a company polo shirt, and carried a digital tablet. He walked the perimeter, took photos, tapped on his screen. He saw a hazardous, collapsed building, a liability. His job wasn't to appraise antique wood. His job was to quantify loss and risk. "Standard procedure in a case like this, Mr. Cobb," Robert explained, not unkindly. "The structure is a total loss. We cover the debris removal and the fair market value of the building as it stood before the collapse." He pulled up a database on his tablet. For a barn of this age and construction in this county, the fair market value for insurance purposes is between $15,000 and $20,000. I'm going to write it up at the top end. $20,000 even. We'll cut a check for the demolition contractor you choose to clear the site. Everett listened, nodded slowly. The number felt abstract. $20,000 wouldn't build a decent shed, let alone replace what had stood there. But it was the phrase debris removal that stuck in his craw. That barn wasn't debris. It was history. It was his grandfather's sweat and skill made solid. He thanked Robert, took the paperwork, and said he'd think about the next steps. Let me tell you about what Everett did next, because he didn't call a demolition company. He called his friend Arlen. Arlen was 75, a retired carpenter who specialized in restoring historic homes. Everett asked him to come look at the wreckage, not as an insurance problem, but as a craftsman. Arlen walked through the fallen timbers with a different eye. He brushed snow off a beam, knelt down, and ran his hand along the surface. He took out a pocket knife and dug gently at the wood. "Forgive me, Silas," Arlen muttered, then looked up at Everett. "This is old-growth heart pine and white oak, Everett. Look at the grain, tight as a fiddle, no knots. This wood hasn't been available since before World War II. He pointed to the axe marks still visible on the beam's surface. "Hand-hewn. They don't make it like this anymore because the trees they came from don't exist anymore." Everett stared at the beam. It was just a piece of his broken barn. What's it worth, Arlen? Not to me. What's it actually worth? Arlen stood up, wiping his hands on his pants. To the right people, to someone building a fancy restaurant in Philadelphia or a mountain lodge out west, who wants that authentic, century-old character, I couldn't give you a number. But it's not $20,000 for the whole pile. It might be $20,000 for a few of these biggest beams. The conversation planted a seed. That weekend, Everett's grandson, Jake, came over. Jake was in college for business and spent an hour showing Everett something on his laptop, the online marketplace for reclaimed lumber. Everett watched silent as Jake scrolled through listings. Reclaimed antique white oak beam 12x12 20 ft length, $4,200. Hand-hewn chestnut timber mortise holes intact, $2,800. Barnwood siding weathered gray per board foot, $8. Everett did the math in his head. His barn had dozens of beams bigger than those in the listings. It had thousands of board feet of siding and floor planks. The numbers started to spin, moving from the abstract into the realm of the staggering. He began to see the collapse not as a loss, but as a dismantling. The insurance company saw a worthless, dangerous eyesore that needed to be carted to a landfill. But the market, a market he never knew existed, saw a goldmine of rare material. This is where the disconnect becomes a chasm. In the insurance industry's playbook, a 100-year-old barn is a depreciating asset. Its value is based on its function, and its cost to replace with a modern, code-compliant pole barn. The material inside is irrelevant. It's all lumped under debris. The system is designed for efficiency, for clean financial closure of a claim. It is not designed to recognize historical craftsmanship or niche market valuations. But Everett was now operating with different information. He went back to the paperwork Robert had left. Buried in the dense paragraphs of the settlement offer was a single line that would change everything. It stated that upon payment for the total loss, all salvage rights to the structure and materials would be transferred from the insurance company to the policyholder, Everett Cobb. They were paying him to take his problem away. And in doing so, they were signing over the one thing they hadn't appraised, the timber itself. Evertain asked for a 2-week extension to arrange his own cleanup. Robert, eager to close the file, agreed. Now Everett had a deadline and a mission. He spent every day on that laptop with Jake, learning the language of the reclaimed wood trade. Board feet, character grade, heartwood versus sapwood. He learned that hand-hewn beams with original tool marks fetched a 30% premium over sawn beams. He learned that white oak was the king, prized for its hardness and water resistance, perfect for flooring and exterior beams. He printed out spec sheets and with a tape measure and a notepad waded back into the wreckage. He cataloged everything, beam by beam, plank by plank. He measured dimensions, identified species, noted the quality. After a week, he had a spreadsheet. The preliminary tally, using the lowest conservative prices he could find online, came to $120,000, and that was before he'd even found a buyer. The following Tuesday, Robert from the insurance company called. "Just checking in, Mr. Cobb. Wanted to see if you'd selected a demolition vendor so we can get that check issued." Everett looked out his kitchen window at the pile of snow-dusted timber. "I'm working on it, Robert. I've decided to handle the dismantling myself." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Sir, I have to advise against that. It's extremely hazardous. Our recommendation and our coverage are for licensed, insured professionals." "I understand the risk," Everett said, his voice calm. "But I'm not demolishing it, I'm deconstructing it. There's a difference." Another pause, longer this time. "Okay, well, the offer stands. $20,000 for the loss and removal. Just let us know who to pay." "Robert," Everett said, choosing his words with the care of a man handling dynamite, "what would happen if I didn't accept the $20,000? If I just took the payment for the loss but refused the debris removal coverage?" Robert was confused. "Why would you do that? You'd be stuck with the entire cost of cleanup." "Maybe," Everett said, "but I'd also be stuck with everything that's left. Officially. He could almost hear the adjuster's mental gears turning, trying to find the catch. The settlement is a package, Mr. Cobb. It's all contingent on the site being cleared. If you don't clear it, we don't pay the full amount. Everett smiled for the first time in weeks. I think I need to understand my policy a little better. Can you send me the full, original documents, the actual contract I signed? There was a sigh, the sound of bureaucracy being invoked. I can have them emailed, sure, but it's pretty standard language. I'm sure it is, Everett said. I'll wait for that email. He hung up the phone and looked at the spreadsheet on his table. $120,000. He knew the insurance company had a term for what they thought his barn was worth, actual cash value. But as he stared at the numbers he'd gathered, at the history laid bare in his field, he realized they were about to discover a different kind of value. A value written not in their actuarial tables, but in century-old growth rings and the swing of his grandfather's axe. And the man who held the key to it all was the one they'd just written off. The insurance documents arrived in Everett's inbox the next morning. 87 pages of dense, single-spaced legalese. And Everett, a man who had spent a lifetime reading equipment manuals and feed labels, sat down at his kitchen table with a pen, a notepad, and a determination to understand every word. Let me tell you about what he found, because the policy was a maze of definitions, but the path through it was clear. The actual cash value of the barn was defined as the cost to replace it with new property of like kind and quality minus depreciation. That's where the $20,000 figure came from. They depreciated a century-old hand-built structure down to the cost of a vinyl-sided utility shed. But then in Section 9, subsection C, was the clause about salvage rights. It stated unequivocally that if the company paid for a total loss, they acquired the right to all remaining property, the salvage. However, it gave the policyholder, Everett, the first right to buy back that salvage for its fair salvage value. The kicker was in the next sentence. If the company chose not to take possession of the salvage, which they almost never did with building debris, all rights reverted to the policyholder upon final payment. Robert the adjuster was following the standard script. Pay the loss, pay for removal, case closed. He wasn't thinking about salvage value because to the insurance company there was none. Debris has negative value. You pay someone to haul it away. But Everett was now holding a document that said if he refused their removal coverage and only took the loss payment, the debris, his timber, was legally his. He would have to pay out of pocket to have it cleared, but he would own every single beam. This was the loophole, the crack in the system wide enough to drive a fortune through. He called Robert back. Robert, I've read the policy. I'm opting out of the debris removal coverage. I'll accept the actual cash value payment for the loss of the barn. I'll handle the site cleanup myself. Silence, then Robert's voice cautious. Mr. Cobb, the removal estimate is $12,000 of that $20,000. If you opt out, you'd only get an $8,000 check. You'd be on the hook for all cleanup costs. That could be more than $12,000. You'd be losing money. I understand the math, Everett said, his voice steady. I'm willing to assume that risk. Please issue the payment for $8,000 and a formal letter stating that all salvage rights to the collapsed structure revert to me upon receipt. Robert processed the request. To him, it was irrational, a farmer choosing a smaller check and a giant headache. He filed the paperwork, shook his head, and closed the claim. As far as the insurance company was concerned, the Everett Cobb file was now resolved. A minor, strange footnote. They had no idea they just handed him the keys to a vault. With $8,000 in the bank and a mountain of timber in his field, Everett's education shifted from theory to practice. He couldn't do this alone. He needed to find the market. His grandson Jake helped him list a single, test item on a specialized reclaimed lumber website. Antique hand-hewn white oak beam, 12x12, 24 ft length, original tool marks visible. They priced it at $3,000, nervous it was too high. The listing went live on a Thursday. By Friday morning, Everett's rarely used email inbox had 17 messages. Architects from Boston, a custom furniture maker in Brooklyn, a man building a hunting cabin in Montana, all asking for more photos, more details if he had more like it. One email was from a company called Heritage Timber based in Virginia. The owner, a man named Marcus, wrote that he'd be in Pennsylvania the following week and asked if he could come see the barn in person. This was the moment everything changed. The online price was a number on a screen. A buyer showing up with a truck and a checkbook was reality. Marcus arrived on a Tuesday. He was in his 50s, dressed in work boots and a flannel but with the sharp eyes of an appraiser. He didn't look at the collapsed barn as a whole. He walked straight to the beams, pulling out a metal probe to check for rot, a small hammer to tap for soundness, a tape measure. He spent 2 hours in silence, moving through the wreckage like a curator in a museum. Finally, he walked back to Everett, who had been watching nervously from the porch. "Mr. Cobb," Marcus said, wiping his hands, "you have a problem." Everett's heart sank. "It's rotten, isn't it?" Marcus smiled. "No, your problem is you have too much good wood. This isn't a hobbyist lot. This is a commercial-grade salvage. You've got maybe 40 major structural beams of white oak and chestnut that are premium grade. The siding, the floor planks, the roof decking, it's all sellable, but the beams are the prize. Do you have a way to extract them, to load them, to store them?" Everett hadn't thought that far ahead. He'd been focused on proving the value, not on the brutal, physical logistics of claiming it. He shook his head. "Right," Marcus said, pulling out a notebook. "Here's what I see. I'm a broker. I buy salvage in situ, meaning I handle the deconstruction, the labor, the hauling, all of it. I pay you a lump sum for the rights to the material, and I take on the risk and work of getting it out and selling it. It's less money for you up front, but zero hassle. The other option is you become a timber seller. You hire a crew to carefully dismantle this, you rent equipment, you find a dry place to store thousands of board feet of wood, and you sell it piece by piece over what could be years. That's a second job." "What's the number?" Everett asked, getting straight to it. "The lump sum." Marcus looked back at the barn, doing mental calculations. "Based on what I can see, the quality and the current market, I could offer you $75,000 today. I'd have a crew here next week." $75,000. It was a fortune. It was more money than Everett had ever held at once. It was also, according to his own spreadsheet, potentially $45,000 less than what he might make if he did it himself. But it was guaranteed and in his bank account in days, with no backbreaking labor, no rental fees, no years of storage. Everett felt the weight of the decision. It was the safe bet, the smart, easy bet. He was 70 years old. He looked at Marcus, then back at the barn his grandfather built. He thought about the axe marks on those beams, the specific history in every chop. He heard his friend Arlen's voice. "The trees they came from don't exist anymore." "I appreciate the offer, Marcus," Everett said slowly, "but I think I need to see this through myself." Marcus nodded, not surprised. He handed Everett his card. "The offer stands for 2 weeks. If you change your mind, call me. And a word of advice. If you're going to do this, you need a sawyer, not just any carpenter. Someone who knows how to work with timber this size without ruining it. And you need to understand grading. The difference between a number 1 grade beam and a number 2 grade beam could be $1,000. He drove away, leaving Everett standing there, the $8,000 insurance check feeling like pocket change, and a $75,000 safety net evaporating behind him. Let me tell you about the sawyer, because finding the right person was the next critical step. Everett asked around, and 3 days later he was introduced to a man named Walter. Walter was a third-generation timber framer who operated a small sawmill on the back of his property. He was in his 60s, built like one of his own oak stumps, with hands that looked like they could wrestle a beam into submission. He came to look at the barn. Walter didn't say a word for the first 20 minutes. He walked, he probed, he squinted. Finally, he spat on the ground and said, They don't grow them like this anymore. This is pre-industrial revolution wood. The growth rings are so tight because the tree grew slow in deep forest fighting for light. That's what makes it hard. That's what makes it worth something. Your insurance fellow thought this was firewood. He thought it was debris, Everett said. Walter let out a short, sharp laugh. Debris, right. Well, I can help you turn this debris into dollars, but it's not simple. You can't just yank these beams out with a tractor. You'll snap them. They're pinned together. You have to deconstruct it in reverse order from how it was built. It's a puzzle. A heavy, dangerous, expensive puzzle. Walter laid out a plan. He would bring his 2 sons and a hired hand. They would need a crane truck for the largest beams. They would need a flatbed trailer. They would need a storage solution. He had an empty, dry machine shed they could rent for $200 a month. The process would take 3, maybe 4 weeks of careful work. His labor quote, $20,000. Everett did the math. Insurance gave him $8,000. He had maybe $10,000 in savings. Walter's fee would clean him out and put him in debt before he sold a single board. He was facing the very real prospect of financial ruin if the market didn't pan out. The safe $75,000 from Marcus was gone. He was all in. He took a deep breath. When can you start? Walter grinned. Monday, we'll start Monday. The first day of the deconstruction was a spectacle. Walter's crew arrived at dawn. They set up a portable sawmill at the edge of the field. The crane truck parked on the firm ground. Walter approached the collapsed barn not as a demolition site, but as an archaeological dig. The goal wasn't to destroy, but to preserve. They started with the roof decking, the least valuable material, carefully prying up the wide pine planks. Each one was cataloged, its length and width marked in chalk, stacked on the flatbed. By noon, they had revealed the massive skeleton of the barn's roof trusses. A small crowd had gathered. Neighbors, curious, came to watch. They saw Everett not as a victim of a storm, but as a man conducting a strange, meticulous operation. The local gossip started. Everett Cobb's lost his mind. He turned down insurance money to play lumberjack. He's gonna get himself killed. The story of the $75,000 offer from Marcus had already leaked, making Everett's decision seem even more foolish. He wasn't just stubborn, he was reckless. But Everett ignored them. He was working alongside Walter's crew, learning. He learned how to drive a metal wedge into a joint to loosen a 100-year-old peg without splitting the wood. He learned how to signal the crane operator to lift a 2,000-pound beam without swinging it into another. He learned the language of the sawyer. Checking was a crack. Waney edge was the natural bark-covered side of the timber. Character marks were the old axe scars and saw kerfs that added value. At the end of the first week, they had the first trailer load of prime beams ready for market. Walter took photos. 6 massive white oak beams, each between 20 and 30 feet long, cleaned of dirt and loose nails. Everett, with Jake's help, listed them as a single lot. 6 antique hand-hewn white oak beams, barn fresh, excellent condition. The asking price, $22,000. This was the real test. The emails from the first listing were inquiries. This was a serious offer for serious money. The listing went up on a Friday evening. By 10 o'clock that night, Everett's phone rang. It was a number from Colorado. The voice on the other end was brisk, professional. "Mr. Cobb, I'm looking at your listing. I'm building a post and beam addition on a home in Telluride. I need those 6 beams. I'll pay your asking price, $22,000. I can have a shipping company there to pick them up Wednesday. Wire transfer okay?" Everett was stunned into silence. He'd prepared for negotiation, for haggling, not for an immediate, full-price offer from halfway across the country. Yes, wire transfer is fine." "Great, I'll email you the paperwork. Please mark them as sold." The call ended. Everett looked at the phone, then at Jake. "We just sold 6 beams." "How many do we have left?" Jake asked. Everett looked at the spreadsheet, then out at the field where dozens more massive timbers lay waiting. "About 34. In that moment, The abstract spreadsheet numbers dissolved into a tangible, breathtaking reality. The first lot had sold in hours for more than the insurance company's total valuation of the entire barn. And he hadn't even touched the chestnut, the siding, the floor planks, the rare tiger maple board they'd found buried in the loft. The news, of course, could not be contained. It spread from Everett's farm to the diner to the feed store and inevitably back to the insurance agency. Robert, the adjuster, heard it third hand from a friend of a friend. That old Cobb barn. Turns out the wood was worth a fortune. He just sold a piece of it for more than we gave him for the whole thing. Robert initially dismissed it as rural exaggeration, but curiosity got the better of him. He did something he'd never done for a closed claim. He Googled reclaimed barn wood prices. The search results were a revelation. Page after page of listings, companies, brokers, prices per board foot that made his head spin. He found a beam similar in description to Everett's listed for $4,500. He did some quick, conservative math. If Everett's barn had even 20 such beams, that was $90,000 in material his company had legally classified as worthless debris. A cold, sinking feeling settled in Robert's stomach. He hadn't made a mistake procedurally. He'd followed the manual perfectly, but he had fundamentally, catastrophically misvalued the asset. He pulled up the Cobb file on his screen. The claim was closed, payment issued, salvage rights signed away. It was irrevocable, but the potential liability wasn't financial, it was reputational. If this story got out, if it became a narrative about how the insurance company threw away a client's six-figure asset, it would be a public relations disaster. His desk phone rang, startling him. It was his district manager. The manager had heard the same rumor. "Robert, the Cobb claim in Pennsylvania. What's this about the timber being valuable? Did we miss something?" Robert's mouth went dry. He was on the bridge, and the water below was rising fast. He had to choose his words with the care of a man handling dynamite, knowing that everything he said next would either contain the blast or make it infinitely worse. Robert took a breath, choosing his words with the precision of a bomb disposal technician. "Sir, we followed standard procedure. The ACV was calculated correctly based on functional replacement cost. The salvage market wasn't a factor in our assessment. It's a niche, aftermarket valuation that isn't recognized in our models." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. A niche market that's paying $22,000 for 6 beams from the barn we valued at $20,000 total. Do you see the perception problem, Robert? "Yes, sir." Find out everything. What he's sold, what he's getting, who's buying it, and review the file. I want to know if there's any angle, any clause, any oversight that gives us recourse. We can't look like we just handed a policyholder a 6-figure asset for $8,000. The call ended. Robert leaned back in his chair, the familiar comfort of his procedural manual gone. He was now in uncharted territory. He spent the rest of the afternoon deep diving into the reclaimed lumber industry. He found forums, auction sites, brokerages. He saw prices that made his actuarial tables look like fantasy. He learned the term old growth and what it commanded. With each click, the pit in his stomach grew. Everett Cobb hadn't gotten lucky. He'd outmaneuvered a billion-dollar corporation with a Google search and a stubborn streak. Meanwhile, on the farm, the money was real. The $22,000 wire transfer cleared. Everett paid Walter's crew for the first week, the tension of debt dissolving overnight. He was now operating with pure profit. The next lot, 4 massive chestnut beams, sold to a furniture maker in North Carolina for $15,000. The pace was relentless. As Walter's crew carefully extracted the timber, Jake managed the online storefront, fielding dozens of inquiries a day. They were no longer just selling beams, they were curating a collection. But success, especially the sudden and visible kind, attracts complications. The first was the local building inspector. A complaint had been filed, anonymous, of course, expressing concern about unsafe commercial excavation and industrial activity on a residential agricultural property. The inspector, a pragmatic man named Dave, arrived, looked at the careful, methodical deconstruction, shook his head and said, "Everett, who did you piss off?" He issued a perfunctory permit for temporary commercial activity, a small fee, and left. The message was clear. Someone in the community wasn't just gossiping, they were weaponizing bureaucracy. The second complication was more direct. Marcus, the timber broker, called again. His tone was different, less friendly, more business. "Everett, I hear you're doing well for yourself, selling directly." "We're managing," Everett said cautiously. "Good, good. Look, I'm calling because my offer needs to be revised. In light of the market activity you've generated, I can see I undervalued the lot. I'm prepared to offer you $90,000 for the remaining timber, right now. That's a $15,000 increase. This is getting complicated for you. The inspectors, the logistics, cash out. Let me handle the headaches." It was a squeeze play. Marcus was acknowledging Everett's success only to use it as leverage. He knew the pressure was mounting. $90,000 was a life-changing sum. It was also, Everett now knew, perhaps half of what the remaining wood was truly worth. He was being offered a premium to go away, to stop proving how wrong the initial valuations had been. "I'll think about it, Marcus." "You do that, but the offer expires Friday. The market can turn." Let me tell you about the third complication, because it was the one Everett never saw coming. It arrived in the form of a certified letter from the Mid-Atlantic Historical Preservation Society. The letter was cordial but firm. It stated that the Cobb Barn, built in 1919, was a notable example of early 20th century vernacular agricultural architecture, and that its wholesale dismantling and sale of integral components could be considered a loss of cultural heritage. They strongly urged Everett to halt sales and consider donating a significant portion of the timber to a museum or a preserved historic site for a tax write-off. Everett read the letter 3 times, his initial confusion hardening into anger. Where were they when the roof was caving in? Where was their grant money for repairs? Now that the wood had monetary value, suddenly it was cultural heritage that he was obligated to give away. He showed it to Walter, who snorted. Historical Society, probably funded by some rich hobbyist who wants your beams for his pet project at a 90% discount. They smell money, same as the broker, just wearing a fancier hat. The letter was a new kind of pressure, one that framed his actions not as savvy, but as sacrilege. It weaponized sentiment against his profit. The narrative in the wider community began to fracture. Some saw him as a local hero, beating the system. Others now whispered that he was destroying history for greed. Amidst this, Robert from the insurance company made his move. He didn't call Everett. He drove out to the farm unannounced. He found Everett and Walter taking a break near the sawmill. Robert was no longer in his polo shirt. He wore a button-down, an attempt at formality. "Mr. Cobb, could we talk for a moment, privately?" They walked to the edge of the field, away from the whine of the saw. Robert got straight to the point. "I've been reviewing your claim, and I've been made aware of your commercial activity with the materials." "Those materials are my property," Everett stated flatly. "Legally, yes, that's not in dispute." Robert shifted his weight. "But there's a principle of indemnity in insurance. The purpose is to make you whole, not to provide a windfall. Our payment was to indemnify you for your loss. If you're profiting substantially from that loss, it raises questions about whether you were truly indemnified or if you've been unjustly enriched." Everett stared at him. "You gave me $8,000 for a barn you said was worth 20. You called the rest debris. You wanted to pay someone to cart it to a dump. How is me finding another use for my own debris unjust enrichment?" Robert held up his hands. "I'm not the enemy here, Mr. Cobb. I'm trying to manage a situation. My company is concerned. If this story becomes public, it makes us look foolish. It could encourage other policyholders to make similar claims to argue for salvage values we never accounted for. It could cost millions. "So what do you want?" Everett asked, his voice cold. "A mutual solution. We could revisit the claim. Perhaps issue an additional payment, a goodwill gesture, to bring your total compensation more in line with a fairer valuation. In exchange, you sign a non-disclosure agreement. You agree not to publicize the details of the claim or your proceeds from the salvage." Everett almost laughed. They were offering to pay him more money to buy his silence. They were admitting their mistake, but only privately, only to contain the damage. The number they were willing to pay to keep this quiet was the only true appraisal of their fear. "What's the number?" Everett asked. "I'm not authorized to say, but it would be substantial. It would be more than fair. And I have to stop selling my timber." "No, but you'd agree not to use our company's name or the details of the settlement in any promotional material or in any story you might tell." Everett looked past Robert to where Walter was guiding a gleaming white oak beam through the saw. He thought of his grandfather's axe, of the 100-year growth rings being revealed not as debris, but as artistry. The insurance company's fear wasn't about money. It was about their entire system of valuation being exposed as a blunt, ignorant instrument. They weren't offering him a settlement. They were offering him a muzzle. "I'll think about it," Everett said, using the same phrase he'd given Marcus. Robert handed him a business card. "Call me by the end of the week, please. It's a good offer, Mr. Cobb. It resolves everything cleanly." As Robert drove away, Walter walked over. "What did the suit want?" "To pay me to shut up." Walter nodded slowly. "Figured, so what are you gonna do?" Everett didn't answer immediately. He walked over to the stack of freshly milled beams. He ran his hand over the smooth, raw surface of the oak, feeling the undulating texture left by the adze a century ago. Each mark was a decision, a stroke of labor. This wasn't just wood. It was a ledger of work, a physical story. The insurance company saw a liability. The broker saw a commodity. The historical society saw an artifact. But to Everett, it was finally, clearly, the inheritance his grandfather had left him. Not just the land, but the worth of the work that had improved it. "I'm going to finish what we started," Everett said quietly. That Friday, 2 offers expired. Marcus's $90,000 buyout, and Robert's silent, substantial hush-money proposal. Everett let them both die. He was all in, and he was playing for the full, transparent truth. And that's when the story broke. A reporter from the regional newspaper, tipped off by someone, maybe a neighbor, maybe someone from the Historical Society, came to the farm. She wasn't hostile, she was fascinated. She wrote a story that wasn't about an insurance claim. It was about a market disconnect. It was titled "From Debris to Gold: The Hidden Fortune in Pennsylvania's Falling Barns." The article quoted Everett sparingly. It quoted Walter on the quality of the timber. It quoted Marcus the broker on market prices. And crucially, it included a single, devastating line from an anonymous insurance industry source who confirmed that standard property policies did not account for salvage value of specialized materials, calling it a known but unresolved gap in valuation methodology. The effect was electric. The story was picked up by agricultural blogs, then by wider business outlets. Everett's phone rang with calls from farmers across the state, the country, asking how he did it. He became an unwilling, unlikely expert. But the most important call came from a law firm in Philadelphia. They represented a class of property owners in a lawsuit against a different major insurer. The case was about underpayment on total loss claims for historic properties. They wanted Everett to be a witness. They wanted his story, his documents, his spreadsheets. Robert's worst fear was realized. The story was public, and it was being used as a weapon in a legal battle that could force the entire industry to change. The call from his district manager this time was not a question. It was an instruction. "You are not to contact the policyholder again. All further communication will be through legal. The file is now with litigation. On the farm, the deconstruction neared its end. The skeleton of the barn was gone. The field was scraped clean, soon to be reseeded. In Walter's rented shed sat the final inventory, a small fortune in stacked, numbered timber. The total sales to date had surpassed $180,000, and they hadn't even sold the character-grade siding, the wide plank flooring, the rare maple boards. Everett stood in the shed with Jake, the air thick with the smell of cut wood and history. The fight was bigger than him now. It was in newspapers and court documents. He had started simply wanting to save something from the wreckage, and in doing so, he had accidentally held up a mirror to a system that confused price with value. He had proven that worth isn't what someone is willing to pay you to make a problem go away. It's what the world, in all its strange and niche corners, is willing to pay to hold onto a piece of the past. But the battle had taken its toll. The neighbors' stares were heavier. The anonymous complaints had escalated. He had money in the bank, more than he'd ever dreamed, and yet he felt the weight of the target on his back. He had won the financial game, but he was standing in the crossfire of a much larger war. And as he looked at the last, biggest beam, a 40-foot king post of pristine chestnut, he knew the final sale wouldn't be the end. It would be the beginning of a new kind of storm. The quiet farmer with the knowing smile was about to learn that when you prove everyone wrong, you don't get to just walk away. You become a lesson, and lessons have consequences. The final beam, the 40-foot chestnut king post, was listed for $15,000. It was the crown jewel, the centerpiece of the entire barn's frame. The bids came in from a museum, a hotel chain, and a private collector in California, but Everett didn't sell it to the highest bidder. He sold it for $5,000 to a nonprofit group rebuilding a historic one-room schoolhouse that had burned down in a neighboring county. The schoolhouse had been built in 1921, 2 years after his grandfather's barn. When the group's director, a woman named Alina, came to pick it up, she told Everett, "This will be the central beam in the new structure. The children will learn under the same kind of wood their great-grandparents did." It wasn't the smartest financial move. It cost him $10,000, but it was the only offer that made the weight of the history feel like a gift instead of a commodity. It was his answer to the Historical Society's letter. With that sale, the physical chapter closed. The shed was empty. The field was green with new grass. The total net profit after paying Walter's crew, storage, permits, and taxes settled at $147,000, a life-changing sum. But the other battles, the ones he'd inadvertently started, were just reaching their conclusions. The class action lawsuit against the other insurance company settled out of court. The terms were confidential, but the industry whisper was that the insurer had agreed to a 7-figure settlement, and more importantly, to revise its claims manual. A new clause was added for unique or historic structures, requiring adjusters to consider specialized material valuation and consult with a certified appraiser for properties over 50 years old. Everett's story, his spreadsheet, his stubborn refusal to accept the debris valuation had become a footnote in corporate policy. He was never called to testify, but his name was in the deposition documents. A precedent, however small, had been set. Robert, the adjuster, was transferred to a different department. He no longer handled property claims. Friends at the company said he'd requested the move. The Cobb file had been a career lesson he didn't want to repeat. Let me tell you about what Everett did with the money, because this is where the quiet farmer's calculus becomes clear. He didn't buy a new truck or take a cruise. He paid off the remaining mortgage on his farmhouse, a debt he'd carried for 30 years. He invested $60,000 in a high-efficiency irrigation system for his bottom fields, an upgrade he'd delayed for a decade. He set aside $25,000 in a trust for his grandson Jake's final year of college and a startup fund if he wanted one. The rest went into savings. It was the most unspectacular, prudent, farmer-like deployment of a windfall imaginable. He used the money not to change his life, but to secure it. to make the farm he loved more resilient, more debt-free, more able to be passed on. The notoriety faded. The newspaper did a follow-up story, The Farmer and the Timber, 1 year later, which mostly noted that Everett was still farming and that the insurance industry was reviewing its methodologies. Neighbors stopped talking about it, the new gossip having moved on. But something fundamental had shifted in Everett's relationship with his community and himself. He was no longer just Everett Cobb, dairy farmer. He was the guy who outsmarted the insurance company. He was the guy who knew about wood. Strangers at the co-op would ask him hesitant questions about their own old sheds. He found himself in the strange position of being an accidental expert. He started a simple blog with Jake's help, a straightforward guide for farmers. What to do if your old barn falls down. It listed steps, asked questions about wood species, warned about brokers' lowballing offers, and emphasized the clause about salvage rights in insurance policies. It wasn't popular. It had maybe a few hundred readers. But every month he'd get an email from a farmer in Ohio or Wisconsin saying, "Your story made me look twice. Thank you." The most unexpected consequence was personal. For years, Everett had seen the barn as a responsibility, a decaying monument to his grandfather's work. Its collapse felt like a failure. But through the long, careful process of deconstruction, of cataloging each beam, of learning its story and finding it a new home, that feeling transformed. He hadn't lost his grandfather's work. He had redistributed it. Pieces of that barn were now floor joists in a Colorado mountain home, a mantel in a Brooklyn loft, table legs in a North Carolina workshop, and the heart of a rebuilt schoolhouse. The work had outlasted the structure. That brought a peace no insurance check ever could. 5 years after the storm, Everett was in a hardware store in town when he ran into Robert, the former adjuster. Robert was buying paint. They stood awkwardly in the aisle for a moment before Robert spoke first. "Mr. Cobb, how are you?" "Can't complain, Robert, you?" "Good, good, I'm in underwriting now, desk job less exciting." Everett nodded. "I read about that lawsuit settling, the one with the other company." "Yeah," Robert said, looking down at a paint can. "It made waves, procedures changed, not because of the lawsuit really, because of the story that came before it." He looked up. "You know, in training now they use a case study, anonymous of course, about a total loss claim where the salvage was misvalued. They call it a failure of imagination." Everett allowed himself a small smile. "Is that what they call it?" "That's the polite term. The takeaway is to look at what you're looking at, not just what the manual says you should see." Robert paused. "I was just following the procedure, you know. It was my job." "I know," Everett said. "I wasn't mad at you. I was mad at the manual. The manual called my history debris." Robert didn't have an answer for that. He just nodded slowly. "Well, you have a good day, Mr. Cobb." "You too, Robert." And that was that. No apology, no reconciliation, just an acknowledgement in a hardware store aisle that both men had been playing different games with the same set of blinders. Let me tell you the final, surprising detail, because the story doesn't end with the money or the policy changes. 2 years ago, Everett's grandson Jake, who had managed the online sales from his dorm room, graduated with a business degree. He moved back home, but he didn't come back to farm full-time. He started a small company with a partner. They don't tear down barns, they evaluate them. Farmers hire them before a storm hits, before an insurance claim is ever filed, to assess the potential salvage value of their aging outbuildings. They provide a report, an independent appraisal of the timber, the hardware, the slate roofing, that the farmer can attach to their insurance policy or use to negotiate with buyers. Jake named the company Cobb Heritage Timber. The logo is a stylized axe and adze. His first client was the son of one of the neighbors who'd gossiped about Everett losing his mind. The business is small, but it's growing. It exists because one old farmer read his insurance policy, saw a different kind of value, and had the stubbornness to prove it. The Farmall tractor that Everett's father bought, the one he learned to drive on, still sits in the new equipment shed, the one paid for with timber money. Everett starts it every month. The filing cabinet in his home office contains 2 folders now. One holds the farm's operational records. The other, a single, thick file, contains every document from the barn. The original insurance claim, Robert's estimate, the salvage rights clause highlighted, the spreadsheet of beams, the sales receipts, and a printout of the newspaper article. On the front, in Everett's careful handwriting, it says, "The barn, 1919-2018, not debris." Everett Cobb is now 75. He still farms, though he lets Jake handle more of the heavy lifting. He still wears the same seed cap. If you ask him about the barn, he'll shrug and say, "It was a lot of work." But if you press him, he'll take you to the field where it stood. There's no marker, just a slight depression in the earth. He'll stand there, silent for a moment, and then he might say something that sums up the entire, unlikely journey. "They insured the building," he'll say, looking at the empty space. "But the building wasn't the valuable part. The value was in the trees my grandfather chose, and the time it took them to grow, and the skill it took to shape them. You can't put a number on that in an insurance book, but you can find it if you know where to look, and you're willing to read the fine print." He'll then point to the new irrigation lines glinting in the sun, or mention Jake's business, and you'll understand. The barn didn't just collapse, it transformed. Its value wasn't lost, it was converted. From a standing structure into liquid capital, from a liability into a legacy, from a pile of what everyone called debris into the very thing that secured the future of the land it once stood on. The insurance adjuster saw a total loss. The farmer, in the end, saw a harvest. And that is the ultimate, quiet payoff. The system is designed for closure, for writing off and moving on. But sometimes, if you're stubborn enough, if you look closely enough at the wreckage, you find that what's being written off isn't the end of the story. It's the first line of a new one. A story where value is decided not by manuals and databases, but by history, by craftsmanship, and by the simple, radical act of refusing to call something worthless until you've truly understood what it is. And with the field green, the shed empty, and the lessons filed away, the story of the barn, the insurance, and the timber is complete. It resolves not with a bang, but with the steady, reliable hum of a tractor in a field, owned free and clear, and the knowledge that some things, if you see them for what they are, can outlast any storm. So what is the lesson here? It's not that insurance companies are foolish or that old barns are secret treasure chests. The lesson is about lenses. The insurance company looked through the lens of risk and replacement. Their system asked one question: what is the cost to make this problem go away? Everett Cobb looked through the lens of material and history. He asked a different question: what is this actually made of, and what is that worth to someone else? The shocking part of this story isn't the price of reclaimed wood. It's that 2 completely legitimate ways of seeing the same object could produce valuations that were off by a factor of 10. The system wasn't broken. It was just blind to an entire dimension of value, and that blindness exists everywhere. Think about what surrounds you right now. The building you're in, the furniture you're using, the contents of your attic or your garage. How much of it has been valued for insurance, for taxes, for your own mental accounting, solely on its utility, its age, its superficial condition? How much of it might hold a different, hidden worth to a niche market, a collector, a historian, or a craftsman? We live in a world of categories and depreciating schedules. We are trained to see obsolescence. We are rarely trained to see potential resurrection. Everett's story is a case study in the cost of that blindness. For the insurance company, the cost was reputational and legal. For the 13 farmers in the original story we mirrored, the cost was their land. For most of us, the cost is smaller, quieter, but no less real. It's the heirloom sold for nothing at a garage sale, the vintage equipment scrapped for metal, the property damage claim settled for a fraction of what the materials could have brought. It's leaving money, sometimes life-changing money, on the table because we didn't have the right information, or we didn't challenge the default valuation. This isn't about becoming a paranoid appraiser of every object in your life. It's about a single, powerful shift in perspective. It's about understanding that value is not a fixed point. It is a conversation. It is a negotiation between what something is, what it could be, and who is looking at it. The insurance adjuster, the auctioneer, the salvage broker, the antique dealer, they are all having different conversations about the same item. The only mistake is hearing one conversation and believing it's the only one happening. Everett Cobb won his particular negotiation because he took the time to listen to the other conversations. He read the contract to learn the rules of his conversation with the insurance company. He went online to listen to the conversation of the reclaimed timber market. He brought in Walter to understand the conversation of craftsmanship and preservation. He assembled the full picture. And in that full picture, the pile of debris became a portfolio of assets. The barn is gone. The money is spent or invested. The policy manuals have a new footnote. But the principle remains, waiting for the next storm, the next collapse, the next moment when something is declared worthless. The world is full of things that have been written off. Some of them truly are. But some of them are like that hand-hewn beam, waiting for someone to see the axe marks, measure the tight grain, and understand that what they're looking at isn't the end of something. It's the beginning of a different story. So the next time you're told something is without value, the next time you're offered a settlement for a total loss, the next time you're about to call the dumpster company, pause, just for a moment. Ask the second question. Look through the other lens. You might not find a fortune in century-old oak, but you will have done the one thing the system doesn't expect. You will have actually looked. And that, in a world that prefers to categorize and move on, is the most valuable skill of all. Thanks for watching.